The following contains situations and circumstances that are relatable to all women, but are still uncomfortable and sometimes quite awful. We don't pull any punches. Listener discretion is advised.
Life's a foolish game. Do you ever feel the same? Well, maybe we could change. Turn the ship another way. Feel it in the darkness. We're sailing right into those jagged cliffs. Yeah. Some say we've always been insane. Hey, life's a foolish game. Life's a foolish game.
Sometimes we're so closely connected to a problem that the answer is staring us in the face. But what happens when others notice the problem too? And worse, see it differently. Welcome to Frenemies, a Toil and Trouble Media original. On this show, we discuss notable women and the rivalries that help define them. Today, we return to the battlefield of the modern feminist movement, where radical Gloria was fighting to change the world, and Betty was fighting other feminists. It's impossible to nail down one specific moment or interaction that set the most famous feud of the women's equality movement in motion. Like most female conflicts, it just wasn't that simple. And it's just as impossible to assign blame or responsibility. Both these women were right and wrong about a number of things. But chalking it up to a simple personality conflict really downplays the perspectives of these women as well. They didn't act out in a vacuum, and both truly felt they were doing the right thing. They just approached it from very different angles. Betty came from an educated, mildly affluent, hyper-traditional upbringing, one she was emotionally connected to deeply. She was also raised to have a deep affinity for the traditional institutions of marriage, government, and gender roles. She wasn't interested in breaking any of them, only correcting the small flaws she felt were essential for the overall sustainability of those systems. She was also educated in a fundamentalist view of psychology by the fathers of the newly adopted science. She was bright and confident, very sure of herself. When Betty made the discovery of the feminine mystique, it must have felt right on par with Erikson's hierarchy of needs or Freud's concept of the id, ego, and superego. Surely better than penis envy, which we all know is crap. What about watching a man accidentally sit on his own testicles would motivate anyone to want the same package? On the other hand, Gloria had largely been left to raise herself and the caregiver for her mother and sister. Her survival and success relied upon her ability to navigate these traditional systems, which were often difficult and cruel. As a child, she'd witnessed firsthand how Betty's beloved traditional system had treated them and grew up to see it as harmful and broken. She also saw what was possible if those systems were dismantled. Her abortion, studies abroad, and involvement in activism showed her a different way. Her bunny story only cemented this, furthering her belief that she couldn't wait for some nameless superhero to fix things. She had to speak up and be a part of it herself. They also had differing priorities. Gloria wanted to advance social justice and female self-empowerment. Any steps in that direction, whether it be for women of color, LGBTQ populations, or other causes, was still progress the women's lib movement could benefit from. To that end, she was willing to support any forward motion, act as a background figure, or lend her endorsement. What mattered was the progress, not who scored. Betty, on the other hand, was focused on major legislative and systemic changes to address and correct the feminine mystique, a societal shift that saw the standardizing of the nuclear family as well as ever-widening opportunity gaps between the sexes. Nothing else mattered. To that end, she often came across as selfish, power-hungry, and controlling. It wasn't personal. She just didn't trust others to properly administer her brain baby. They also had opposing views of what the movement should look like. Hyper-focused on recognizing and correcting the feminine mystique, Betty truly believed that if the trend were reversed, everything would be right with the world. For Gloria, it wasn't that simple. To her, the only way to make things right is if every social justice cause was advanced and everyone was included. Her critics are quick to point out that sometimes she didn't recognize who everyone was, but she tried. Nor did their personalities always gel. As a leader, Betty was fierce and impatient with no tolerance for dissent. She would give fellow feminists the boot at the first sign of question, angrily volleying personal and often public insults and attacks. To her, those who were not completely with her were against the cause, and the best exit strategy for such an offender was crawling away in shame. Even when collaborating with other leaders, Betty made a point of clawing out a place of importance for herself. And why not? In her eyes, she discovered the root cause for female inequity. Shouldn't she get proper credit? Gloria preferred to collaborate and partner on just about everything, which led her to be on the forefront of many victories. But over the years has also left her open for criticism, especially related to issues of bias. One of the things white women are criticized of frequently, and should be, is perpetrating the concept that their perspective and experience is the same as everyone else's. When you examine Gloria's public career, you see countless examples of this. But you also see countless examples of mindfulness and self-correction. She hears these critiques and tries to address them, admitting when she's wrong and changing her perspective accordingly. And as we learn and grow, that's all we can really do while we navigate the complex issues related to the human experience as a whole. They also had differences in patience and tolerance. In spite of Betty's many personal lobs against her, Gloria rarely swung back, especially in settings where those interactions could snowball out of control. She just didn't think it served the women's movement to offer snarky quotes critics and reporters could take out of context. But she didn't shy away from the difficulties she had working with the pioneer either. Quote, "I know other women with whom I have the same ideological differences with whom I can work," leaving Betty with both her dignity and a seat apart from the rest of the class. And there was very little else she could do. Betty saw every opposing opinion as a direct challenge to her authority and an attack against her credibility and expertise. In the face of such mostly imagined hostility, she came out swinging. But unlike Gloria, she had no problem with an audience. She preferred it. She would regularly and brutally call out her so-called enemies in the media, and didn't treat them any better when she met them face to face. Nor were their goals aligned. For Betty, it was all or nothing, and all her way or nothing. Her feminine mystique had a beginning point and an end. Anything that didn't advance the legislative and systemic changes identified in her book were unnecessary. Or worse, a distraction from the real efforts, and therefore unforgivable. Gloria saw any step in the right direction as progress and momentum for the next. But she also had a more nuanced vision of its final destination. It was continual, a journey. Roe versus Wade was a good start, but it was far from an end. Nor could they agree about the impact of female dissent at all. Where Betty saw them as vicious rivals, Gloria took conflicts like this with a grain of salt. Quote, "What's important to remember is, though women may be a problem for other women, they don't have the power to be the big problem. Women could be adversaries, but could never be the worst adversaries, simply because they didn't hold the power to do so." To Gloria, it's that tendency to strike at the first woman in reach that keeps us from recognizing who the real enemies are: the men in charge, in the office, and the pulpit. This probably had to do with the differences and what they personally had to lose. Betty really was the middle-class wife and mother she'd written about, back when Gloria was still a bunny-clad reporter in disguise. Seeing women as cookie-cuttered creatures and herself as an example of the entire female experience, she truly worried about the feminine mystique's effects on those she really cared about. Anything deviating from that was abnormal and flawed, and she was too busy protecting her carbon copies to worry about deviance. The emotional buy-in for Betty was high too. Given the psychological and academic significance of her discovery, she had a lot on the line. Not only in its recognition and validation, but the resulting societal change it would and should have. If she couldn't fix the feminine mystique, countless generations of Bettys would be affected, where Gloria's personal stakes were more altruistic. If she failed to advance women's liberation and human rights, we'd all lose. Looks might have something to do with it too. In the 1970s, it was hard to deny. Gloria would say her rise to the top of the movement was really accidental. She had no intention of running a political organization, just speaking her mind and being civically active. But her youthful, almost supermodel appearance was a key component of her public persona. There were plenty of times she was told the only reason people were listening to her at all was because she was hot. Betty couldn't compete in this category and would feel ridiculous trying. She was a respected academic and a legitimate authority. But none of that seemed to matter. Not now that so many people were listening to the newbies. The Friedans finally divorced in 1969. If their marriage had been stressful and messy, the divorce followed the same path. During the court proceedings, Betty claimed Carl was jealous of her fame and influence and was at times abusive to her. Carl denied this, stating she was just difficult to get along with. Which few people denied. And yet, she never made the same allegations about anyone else. And let's face it, she had plenty of ferocity to go around. But since so much of this is alleged to have occurred behind closed doors, we'll never know. And it's not the first time domestic violence played out like this. Betty found solace within her career and her political action, continuing to write and lecture while teaching at New York University and the New School for Social Research. And with less time dedicated to a toxic marriage, she founded the National Abortion Rights Action League with a couple of friends. Gloria continued to write. In an essay published in Time magazine on August 31st, 1970, she penned what it would be like if women win, and the utopian future she envisioned. In it, she wrote that silly descriptors specifying a woman's marital status would be abandoned, and marriage would be recognized for those outside the heterosexual circle as well. Quote, "Single women will have the right to stay single without ridicule, without the attitudes now betrayed by spinster and bachelor. Lesbians or homosexuals will no longer be denied legally binding marriages, complete with mutual support agreements and inheritance rights." Granted, she also included some pretty disparaging remarks about gay men, postulating that with fewer ineffective parents damaging their sons, that boys would be less likely to deny or reject their masculinity. Which has nothing to do with it. To anyone listening who needs to hear it, being gay, straight, or bi has nothing to do with poor parenting or mental illness. It's the way you were born. And sweetie, you were born perfect, no matter what someone writes, says, or blurts out on social media. And even if the evangelicals are right, and everyone who does not fit their ridiculous mold never sees the gates of heaven, add my name to the guest list, bitches, because hell is gonna be lit. But this was also 50 years ago, so Gloria will get there. It's a learning curve. On August 26, 1970, in response to the reality that women at the time were paid 40% less than men in similar fields of work, Betty took her ideas to New York and organized the Women's Strike for Equality. The protest brought awareness to the cause and attention to the group itself. Now was now a force, but Betty wasn't able to enjoy victory for long. Months later, she was forced to step down as president due to her disagreements with the group's refusal to accept men as members, but allow lesbians. I don't know what to say. She really had it out for lesbians. #hardcore Karen. Following the takeover of the Ladies' Home Journal later that year, Gloria realized the value of a women's movement magazine and joined forces with a couple friends to launch Ms. Debuting originally as an insert, it evolved into a full-fledged magazine a year later with its own circulation and audience. And it wasn't long before Betty accused it and Gloria of profiteering. The next year, Betty lobbied for the constitutional ratification of the Equal Rights Amendment, legislation that would codify rights for all citizens regardless of sex. You know, that same loophole that was used by the Supreme Court recently to strike down a woman's right to choose. While she failed to win over enough delegates, Gloria was invited to speak at the National Press Club, the first woman to do so. Then she ran as a delegate for Shirley Chisholm in New York. She lost, but it still burned Betty's muffins. She was sure people were paying more attention to Gloria because she was easier on the eyes. She almost threw up when the June 1971 issue of American Vogue said her rival had the looks of a film star and called her the most attractive activist in women's lib. Jerks. In a 1972 article for the magazine Off Our Backs, Betty berated Gloria's brand of so-called feminism and weird preoccupation with lesbians, claiming that it threatened to leave real women behind. You know, those other self-identifying white women with their husbands in the suburbs. Who was going to look after them? But nobody seemed to care. And a month later, Betty was reminded of it again when at the first meeting of the National Women's Political Caucus, a group she and her posse founded, more than 300 turncoats elected that little twit as their spokeswoman, even though Betty openly campaigned for the job. To be fair, Gloria didn't ask for it. She wasn't even there for the election, which might have been enough for other women to concede. But Betty still fumed. With her mouth directly attached to the press's whatever, she stood to lose even more control. The movement would become even more liberal. As she listened to Gloria's historic address to the women of America, in which she stated the movement wasn't a simple reform, but instead a revolution, Betty couldn't help but seethe, especially when articles covering the event began blasting headlines reporting that she had succeeded in displacing her, labeling her the Mother Superior of woman's lib. Not cool. In response, or maybe just to remind everyone who the real feminist OG was, Betty penned an article for McCall's magazine where she outed Gloria by name. accusing her of female chauvinism and the crime of making a woman apologize for loving her husband. Radical feminism must stop, she blasted, and a new return to systemic and legislative priorities had to happen. With her at the helm, naturally. When the caucus met again in 1973, Betty ran for a seat on the National Steering Committee. As a founder, she thought she was a shoo-in. And initially, after elections, she was told she won, only to be informed later she lost. When a recount was conducted, it was determined that Betty didn't win the seat. But, you guessed it, Gloria did. Scholars and biographers for both women agree that this was a harmless oversight. No evidence of conspiracy was ever found. But Betty took the loss personally, accusing the group of ballot fraud and retaining a lawyer. It didn't change anything, but it did give those members, still afraid of her, reason to ignore her calls. They eventually moved to expel her, as much for her politics as her temper. Gloria's influence and that of the rest of the second waivers were finally in a position to align the movement with more vulnerable populations, including support for people of color, the impoverished, and the LGBTQAI+ community. Betty was officially put out to pasture. She was crushed. But the defeat only strengthened her resolve. Unwilling to go down without a fight, she renewed her critique in the New York Times, calling Gloria and other lesbian allies disruptors. The ambush was so personal and the attack so brutal, Gloria felt compelled to defend herself. But the sucker punch didn't go the way Betty had hoped. To her disappointment, the movement saw it as toxic and moved further away. And McCall's named Gloria their Woman of the Year. The honor upset Betty so much that when Gloria's mother met her at an event and tried to shake her hand, she refused it, sneering at the bewildered woman and walking away. The mid-1970s saw Betty showered in accolades. She received an honorary doctorate of humane letters from her alma mater. The Girl Scouts elected her to their national board, and the American Humanist Association named her Humanist of the Year. She began serving as a delegate for the UN's Women's Conference and lecturing at colleges and institutions. She also began to distance herself from NARAL's objectives to repeal anti-abortion laws. Again, claiming the issue distracted from what she saw as the real issues holding women back. But she had publicly declared the validity of abortion rights in the past, so there was no actual need to codify this then, right? Her loyal supporters noticed the omission and tried to overlook it, lest they face her ire. And there was still plenty of it to go around. In between speaking events, she defended her choice to write for mainstream magazines like McCall's instead of Gloria's Ms. From literally no one. No one wanted to meet Betty in a dark alley, much less question her publishing decisions. So this was more of a shadowboxing match or a surprise beatdown, reminding everyone who the baddest bitch in the yard still was. Quote, "It didn't interest me to talk to the already convinced. I was interested in writing for those 8 million women's magazine readers. The suburban housewives, the women who had children and or jobs, with husbands or without, who still had to deal with housekeeping, meals, and clothes as I did. You know, people who looked like her." In 1976, she used her leverage to persuade the Democratic Party to give women half its delegate seats, and consequently half of the party's caucus voice. She followed it up by publishing her next book, It Changed My Life, Writings on the Women's Movement, collecting her previous talks, essays, and columns, as well as continuing her criticism of lesbianism, non-traditional families, and random hatred of men, which she said was dangerous and diversionary, reducing the conversation to talk and anger. But Gloria couldn't help but wonder, what were the chances of advancing social justice if one was afraid of being diversionary? And since when was Betty concerned about pissing someone off? In response to the highly publicized sex reassignment surgery of tennis player Renee Richards in 1975, a women's lib influencer claimed the coverage was a diversion from the widespread problems of sexual inequality. Think it was Betty? No, it was Gloria. Then she doubled down. Quote, "Feminists are right to feel uncomfortable about the need for and uses of transsexualism," adding that while she supported an individual's right to identify as they choose, some transsexuals surgically mutilate their own bodies in order to conform to a gender role that is unavoidably tied to physical body parts. Yeah, I know. In 1978, she penned an essay for Cosmopolitan titled "If Men Could Menstruate." In it, she suggested periods would be a badge of honor instead of the source of shame and embarrassment we experience. It got a lot of laughs from readers, but not Betty. If anything, she rolled her eyes and called it a cheap stunt. In 1981, while teaching as a visiting professor, Betty reflected upon the progress of her beloved movement and didn't like what she saw. Many of the powerful societal forces maintaining the status quo were still there, as well as just as many feminist radicals determined to run it into the ground. Like those transsexual comments? What did that have to do with women? She compiled her musings into another book titled The Second Stage. In it, Betty canonized her original efforts, those she described as solidifying women's participation and personal control as the first stage of feminism, and declared it complete. Which is kind of interesting, seeing as she didn't really consider anyone else's perspectives when deciding what did and didn't make it on the list. Now, she wrote, it was time for the movement to enter a second stage, one that restructured institutions and the division of power within them, with a revised emphasis in terms of family, love, and work. Helped by men. She wrote that the movement didn't fail in the battle for equality, but within the family. Again, putting forth demands for increased childcare options, parental leave, flexible work hours, and the choice to have children. Although she insisted she wasn't for abortion. Nor was she about to concede to all those extreme ideas posed by Gloria and the second waivers. To her, their fascination with tying women's advancement to porn and lesbian rights ignored the real needs of women in terms of family and nurturing, and risked creating a feminist mystique. Quote, equality and the personhood of women never meant destruction of the family, repudiation of marriage and motherhood, or implacable sexual war with men. Yep, still denying lesbians were women too. Ugh. She rang in the millennium by publishing her memoir, Life So Far. In it, she re-examined her life and the significant events that shaped her perspectives, her parents' relationship, as well as her own failed marriage. She also worked in a few jabs at those pesky dissenters of hers, including Gloria, who she coyly accused of hypocrisy, filling newspapers and magazines with anti-male dictums while dating very glamorous men. And, quote, having her hair streaked at Kenneth, a very fancy New York salon. In September of that same year, Gloria married one of those glamorous men, businessman David Bale. She was 66, the groom was 59. You go, girl! The wedding was performed at the home of Wilma Mankiller, the first female principal chief of the Cherokee Nation. They were married for only 3 years before he died of brain lymphoma in 2003. Betty continued to fight right up to her 80s, warning that economic declines would scapegoat women and that downsizing industries might send them back home where they belong. She continued to advocate for a domestic agenda that included childcare, healthcare, housing, and jobs, and that women should fight alongside men to achieve it. She died of congestive heart failure at her home in Washington, D.C. on February 4th, 2006. It was her 85th birthday. Gloria still makes headlines advocating for social justice. In 2013, President Barack Obama presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. That same year, in an op-ed in The Advocate, Gloria revisited her 1977 comments about transsexual people and body mutilation. In it, she explained her comments were meant to be taken in the context of surgical assaults and female genital mutilation. She expressed unequivocal support for the transgender community, saying that their real, authentic lives should be celebrated, not questioned. She also apologized for any pain her words might have caused, which was a while coming, but still made it. In 2020, she and Mona Sinha co-wrote an op-ed for the New York Times in which they opposed the elimination of civil rights protections for transgender health care by the Trump administration, claiming, quote, "The health of any of us affects the health of all of us, and excluding trans people endangers us all." So good for her. Stay tuned after the break for more about our girl, Gloria. Known for carefully camouflaging social issues and reflecting them back, writers of comic books make discussing the complex and uncomfortable an art. As a child, Gloria grew up reading Wonder Woman comics, fascinated by the power and heroic acts of its star. In the early 1970s, under the creative control of Samuel R. Delany, Wonder Woman saw her power diminished and her costume replaced in issue number 202. Outraged, Gloria put her fictional idol on the cover of the first issue of Ms. Magazine, along with a heartfelt essay about the significance of the character. Soon after, Warner Brothers Communications, a Ms. corporate investor and DC Comics owner, fired Delany and restored the superhero's powers and costume. Little did she know that Delany, charged with overhauling the comic's storyline, was working on a 6-issue story in which Wonder Woman would do battle over an abortion clinic where she would defend women trying to use their services. After his firing, the outlines and storyboards were scrapped, and the landmark issues were never published. This has been Frenemies. Thanks for listening. Frenemies is a production of Toil and Trouble Media, executive produced by Jennifer Beck. This episode was also written and performed by Jennifer Beck. I'm kind of a big deal. Additional production assistance was provided by Aaron Iris, and our music was performed by Snowflake and Admiral Bob. Thanks, guys. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen and tell your friends. It's a cheap way to support us, and it really helps the show get noticed. Tell your frenemies, too. We're good with that. And be sure to subscribe wherever you listen and follow us on social media so you'll never miss an episode. If you want even more Toil and Trouble media in your life, be sure to check out our Patreon page, where, for a couple bucks, you can get access to early and ad-free episodes of all our shows, and our website at toilandtroublemedia.com, where we have merch, blogs, and much more. And as always, thanks for listening.